When Isabella caught her daughters-in-law being intimate with knights, she resorted to extremely cruel punishment to ensure that it would not happen again. Isabella of France began her life as an innocent French maid and ended it as one of the most ruthless monarchs England has ever seen. 14th century France was a snake's nest of dangerous beauties, court intrigue, and all-out war. Somehow Isabella of France managed to master all three spheres, from her beginnings as a naive bride to her stunning revenge on her own relatives. There is a reason why she became known as the She-Wolf of France. Isabella was born around 1295 into an extremely influential and very old family. Her father, King Philip IV of France, was known as the handsome one for his looks, but he was also described as neither man nor beast, but a statue for his cold demeanor. Meanwhile, her mother Jeanne died when she was still young, amid rumors that Isabella's father had murdered her. As the daughter of the King of France, and a calculating king at that, Isabella was always destined for a politically advantageous marriage. In her case, it happened very quickly. When she was 12 years old, she was sent to England to marry King Edward II, a man about 10 years older than her. The royal union took place on January 25th, 1308. I know she doesn't look 12 years old here. Braveheart wasn't historically accurate, let's just go with it. It was already common knowledge in Europe that Isabella's father was handsome, as were her brothers, but one man described her around the time of her marriage as the handsomest of beauties in the kingdom, if not in all Europe. Shortly before their marriage, Edward became involved with a favorite courtier, Pierre Gaveston. The debate over the exact nature of Edward and Gaveston's relationship continues unabated, with some historians describing them as foster brothers and others pointing to a more scandalous truth. At 12 years old, Isabella could hardly have been much of a temptation to Edward on their wedding day, but his treatment of her shocked people. At the coronation feast on his return to England as a couple, her new husband reportedly spent most of his time with Gaveston and ignored his young bride. It soon became common knowledge that the new queen hated the king's favorite, and tension grew in the royal household. The new queen was alone at a foreign court, but she was not alone in her views. Edward's courtiers, especially the strong faction of barons, resented the responsibilities he was giving Gaveston. Moreover, she also had her father's support in France, so she did what any daughter would do. She complained to Papa. Isabella's father naturally became furious when he heard about the way the King of England was treating his daughter. Enough fury that the French royal family soon allied themselves with Edward's disgruntled courtiers. After secretly funding Edward's barons and influencing affairs in Parliament, Isabella and her allies secured Gaveston's expulsion from court. In the end, nothing could keep Edward and Gaveston apart, and he lived in exile for only about a year. When he returned, Isabella changed tactics. She decided it was better to join Gaveston than to try to defeat him. Where she had opposed him before, she was now his ally. It was a smart move, and it worked to unite the royal house, but only temporarily. In 1311, the barons rebelled again, this time not only against Gaveston, but also against his new ally Isabella, briefly banishing her from her own court. Because of all this going on, Isabella's kingdom was in full-blown civil war. By 1312, she held her own on her husband's side while he fought the barons, as did Piers Gaveston. But that summer, the king's favorite met a violent end. The barons surrounded his castle, captured him, and swiftly executed him. On the day Piers Gaveston was executed, Isabella was several months pregnant, and in November of that year, she gave birth to a son, the future Edward III. The healthy boy helped solidify her position as queen, but it did not calm tensions at her court. Over the next few years, England was falling apart. Not only did Edward suffer humiliation and a series of defeats at the hands of the Scots, but the Great Famine hit the country. Edward's boyish barons were quick to blame him, and they did not spare Isabella either, taking much of her funds and trying to control her house to gain more power over the kingdom. Although she had always been involved in court politics, Isabella now began to believe that if her husband could not rule properly, perhaps she could, and began attending council meetings and acquiring more land for herself. Around this time, Isabella's husband found a new favorite, Hugh Despencer Jr., a man about his age who came from a family that had long supported Edward, especially the patriarch Hugh Sr. On the surface, this might have seemed like a good thing, at least for Edward's personal life, but it was one of the most dangerous things he could do. In fact, thanks to their loyalty to Edward, the Despensers had many enemies at court, and the barons were immediately enraged when Edward began, as he had with the late Piers Gaveston, showering Hugh with gifts. Perhaps most importantly, Isabella failed to develop the same alliance with Hugh that she eventually established with Piers. In 1322, Edward and Isabella were camped and fighting Scotland again when, in Isabella's opinion, Despenser's negligence or even outright antagonism resulted in her being cut off from her husband and his men. Worse, Scottish troops began to harass her now vulnerable home, eventually killing 2 of her maid of honor. When Isabella finally made it to safety, she became enraged at Edward and his favorite, and she let him know. Probably tired of the sight of her husband, she left for a nearly year-long journey through England. To make matters worse, tensions with Isabella's native France were rising. Fearing her ties in France in the midst of a tense political climate, the king and the Despensers seized Isabella's lands, seized her home, put her French staff behind bars, and took her youngest children and placed them in the custody of the Despensers. After more Franco-English bickering, Isabella's brother, now King Charles IV of France, seized all of King Edward's French possessions in 1325. In response, Edward sent Isabella to her native country to make some kind of peace. Many of the nobles who opposed Edward took this as a sign that the power of the King of England was crumbling. They had no idea how true this was, because while Isabella was supposedly trying to smooth over French and English egos, she was doing something else. While at the French court, there is strong evidence that Isabella had an affair with an Englishman named Roger Mortimer, a nobleman who, like Isabella herself, loved the fine arts, liked to spend money, and had long despised the Despensers. In fact, when it came to rebellion, Mortimer had a history. In 1321, Mortimer was with a group of other opposing lords leading the Despensers' war against Edward's favorite Hugh and his powerful family. Mortimer was thrown into the Tower for his troubles and made a spectacular escape after some friends in high places spiked drugs on his warders at a feast. When news of Isabella's behavior reached King Edward in England, he began trying to bring her home and into his own power. In mid-1326, Isabella put a plan in motion. After months of turmoil, gathering allies, and simmering in her resentment toward her husband, she and her supposed lover Roger Mortimer assembled an army, complete with warships, and set sail to invade England. Isabella and Mortimer landed at Orwell on the east coast of England and led their troops inland, gathering supporters along the way. It was actually incredibly easy. Most people were tired of Despensers, and many hailed her as a savior. When he heard the news of the invasion, King Edward, unaware of his unpopularity, fled to Wales. Within months, Isabella's men had not only captured Hugh Despenser Sr., but also captured King Edward II and his favorite Hugh Jr. in their hideout in Wales. Isabella had gotten her targets, and all that remained to be done was to punish them. There was no mercy for Isabella's enemies, even if she wanted to give it. Her supporters were bloodthirsty. Hugh Despenser Sr.'s remains were literally fed to dogs, while Edward's favorite, Hugh Jr., survived having people scratch Bible verses on his skin before he was hanged as a thief, a low insult to a man of noble birth. He was then quartered. Isabella had a real problem with Edward. Not only was he still her legal husband, but he was also still the rightful king. Although Parliament had decided to overthrow him and sentence him to house arrest for life, she worried that they wouldn't carry out the sentence, or that even if they did, it wouldn't be enough. By the following September, Edward was a prisoner at Berkeley Castle near the Welsh borders. On the 23rd of that month, Isabella received news that Edward had died of an unfortunate and vague accident. Given the convenience of Edward's death to Isabella, historians have debated for centuries whether Isabella and Mortimer killed him. We will probably never know the truth. Isabella certainly had a motive, but perhaps she was just lucky and Edward died of ill health in captivity. There is an even stranger interpretation of events, though. After news of Edward's death, there were persistent rumors that he had not actually died, but had escaped and was now living somewhere in Europe. While Edward would not have been the first ruler to be the subject of such rumors, he is one of the few whose historians support the theory. Historians have examined contemporary evidence, including Fesca's famous letter from the 1340s that claims he was alive, and argue that Edward did indeed live, hiding under a different name for the rest of his life. Isabella now had everything she wanted when she first set sail from France and ruled as regent for her young son, but it all fell apart alarmingly quickly. She and Mortimer had always loved expensive things, including flamboyant displays of power. This displeased the court, and soon tensions flared up again and almost led to civil war until Isabella's son took matters into his own hands. The new Edward III had no love for the way his mother and her lover spent the kingdom's money, and even less for his mother's lover himself. Things came to a dramatic climax just days before Edward III turned 18 and officially came into his own. He ordered Mortimer and Isabella to be seized at Nottingham Castle. Isabella immediately realized what was happening. Even as they were being dragged away, Isabella begged her son to spare Mortimer's life. It was useless. Edward ordered Mortimer to be hanged in November 1330, and his body was displayed on the gallows for all to see for 2 days. Isabella then managed to save her own skin in this fiasco, thanks most likely to the fact that she was the king's mother and only received a period of house arrest at Windsor Castle. But the true punishment was invisible. There is some evidence that she suffered a nervous breakdown after Mortimer's death, and it took her some time to regain her health. Isabella remained a constant figure at court, and was, to the surprise of many, something of a socialite. She retained her interest in jewelry and the accumulation of wealth, and soon began to adore her grandchildren. After a life lived almost too well, she passed away quietly at Hertford Castle in her early 60s. In their better, earlier days, King Edward II and Isabella relied on the support of their family in France to assert their power, and in 1313 they paid a visit to Paris to look their patrons in the eye. While visiting her brothers, Isabella presented them and their wives with special embroidered purses. Edward and Isabella returned to London and thought no more of it until one fateful day. At her return dinner a few months later, Isabella noticed 2 knights wearing her specially sewn purses. This led her to a chilling conclusion. She realized that her brothers' wives must be having an affair with these men. In a world where legitimate heirs were everything, this wasn't just gossip. Female infidelity meant destabilizing the succession. An alarmed Isabella told her father of her suspicions the next time she saw him. That's when the situation exploded. Isabella's father, Philip, was outraged by what he heard, and his reaction was devastating. It led to the scandalous case of the Tour de Nesle, named for the alleged place where wives met their illicit lovers. After observing the knights and determining that there was likely a liaison, a French court charged the women and men with adultery. After the Tour de Nesle case, Isabella's sisters-in-law were shaved naked and sentenced to life behind bars. Their knights were much less fortunate. After torture, they were executed, probably by the cruel method of quartering. All because Isabella had a sharp eye. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy uncovering the best stories in history, put likes and subscribe to keep exploring with us.